So thank you very much indeed, Wendy, for the time and generosity. I'm really pleased to talk to you. I have a general introductory note about you, and then we can start with the questions. So if something is missing, please feel free to add. Wendy Brown is an American political theorist of University of California, Berkeley. Her work has profoundly shaped contemporary critiques of neoliberalism, democracy, and power. Drawing on thinkers such as Foucault, Marx, Nietzsche, and Arendt, Brown analyzes how modern forms of governance hollow out democratic life while reshaping subjects as market actors. Her major works include States of Injury, Power and Freedom in Late Modernity, Politics Out of History, Undoing the Demos, Neoliberalism Stealth Revolution, and In the Ruins of Neoliberalism. So is it correct?
Almost.
Almost.
My most recent book is called Nihilistic Times, Thinking with Max Weber. And
Sure.
I have, for the past 5 years, been retired from Berkeley, and I have a position at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, where I'm a professor in the School of Social Science.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. So I start with my first question, non-question, I don't know how to call it, but although the timing of this conversation coincides with the tragic situation in Iran and the killing of many innocent people, a disaster that casts its shadow over thought, at least my thought, I nevertheless began this conversation with some difficulty. The difficulty I have been grappling with over the past few days is rooted in a stifling force that shrinks the space for thought and reflection in a broader sense. So a voice from inside and outside tells me, I admit, I confess, that I should only think of what is happening in Iran, a position which not only comes into contact with the logic of identity politics, but also displays a very harsh criticism, namely that at this particular historical juncture, why turn one's attention instead to a discussion of neoliberalism? Can you, Wendy, please help me with this challenge, with this dilemma that I have had?
I don't know if I can help you, Madi, but I'm going to engage your question. First, thank you for having me here. I think, first of all, to understand the predicament of Iran, one obviously has to already move outside of Iran and think about imperialism, think about at least as far back as the US positioning of itself in relationship to the Shah of Iran as a puppet power for the US, and a larger Middle East politics that has been negotiated and changed over the course of the Cold War and the extraordinary uprising in Iran of the past month, and the tremendous courage and sacrifice that so many Iranians made in struggling for an opening and a new arrangement of power. One already is forced to think about the global construction of the Iranian predicament and the particulars of the most recent uprising, again with my president throwing his weight around, but not in a serious way, not in a way that any Ayatollah had to, in the end, bow to, but recognizing that between Israel and the US and other Arab nations, the Iranian situation is never just Iran. So I'm saying what you all already know. The place of neoliberalism here is both significant and not. That is to say, there's nothing that the revolution that is neoliberalism didn't touch. There's nothing in the past 50 years of neoliberalism that on the globe that has not been affected in some way by not just globalization, not just deregulation, not just privatization, not just aiding and abetting corporate capital and now finance capital, but also the fundamental transformation of the international order that neoliberalism has brought, and now obviously brought to something of an end, as we have seen more recently in both Putin, well, in the squaring off between China, Russia, and the US, and the absolute indifference to the fates and conditions of everybody else, and the resurrection of a spheres of influence form of foreign policy by the remaining hegemons, including the dying hegemons. So neoliberalism matters as a way of understanding parts of what's happened to the global order and parts of what's happened in Iran itself, obviously making life more and more unaffordable, the economy tanking, the currency a mess, the prospects for a middle-class Iranian existence withering on the vine. That's neoliberalism, but it doesn't explain everything. And it certainly doesn't explain the thing that people most often want to explain, which is, why did this uprising happen now? And why was it so much more powerful than the last three, even though it's been built steadily? I mean, every time Iranian people hit the street, you know that they will be repressed, you know that the guns will come out. And at the same time, every time the promise is brighter, every time the crowds are bigger, the demands are clearer, and someday Iran will be free. There's no doubt about it. And that's to one side of the question of what neoliberalism has done to intensify the immiseration of the Iranian people beyond what an Ayatollah does at the level of repression or enforcement of Islamic law.
Absolutely. Thank you. It helped me enormously.
It's embarrassing, I will say,
It's
to be telling
helpful,
you
Wendy.
all of this because you know it. Go
But
ahead.
it's very, I mean, this affirmation really helps enormously, especially in such frustrating times.
Yeah.
Thank you again. So I just go to a bit to the core of your research. You have argued in different books that neoliberalism is not just an economic program, but also a governing rationality that reshapes how we understand freedom, responsibility, and even ourselves as political subjects. How would you explain this broader project to someone encountering your work for the first time?
Uh-huh. Well, first of all, we need to offer recognition where it is due. This is not my idea. It's actually an idea that Michel Foucault helped the world understand. And what Foucault grasped about neoliberalism was that it was not just a set of economic policies. It certainly does comprise some policies. I've mentioned them already: deregulation, privatization of public goods, stripping out the welfare state, reversing progressive taxation in favor of taxation that aids and abets capital and is often more punitive toward working and middle-class people. So replacing progressive taxation with regressive taxation. There are other elements of neoliberal economic policy, but the important thing is that these policies come from and are part of what Foucault calls a larger order of political reason or political rationality. And what he helped us understand is the shift from liberalism to neoliberalism as one that involved a transformation of the character of the state, the character of society, and the character of the individual subject. And what he taught us is that with neoliberalism, the state, interestingly, becomes a more overtly constructivist actor. That is, the state is turned to construct and support markets, not just to get out of the way. It's not the night watchman state of classical liberalism. It's a state that is actively engaged in the support and the facilitation of capitalist accumulation. And that means constructing markets, that means intervening where appropriately. It doesn't mean distorting distributions. So the big distinction here is that the Keynesian state or the welfare state, the social state, is a redistributive state. And that's what the neoliberals attacked. They didn't want a redistributive state. They wanted a state that would support capital with the recognition that capital does not by itself run with ease. It actually needs the support of political and political actors, political policy, and legal codes. So the state is transformed in this way. It becomes an overtly capitalist state, as opposed to, we might say, covertly capitalist during the heyday of liberal democracy and social democratic practices. Thatcher famously declared there's no such thing as society, only individual men and women. And part of the neoliberal project, part of neoliberal reason, is also involves this assault on the very idea of the social. The neoliberal Hayek famously referred to the idea of society or the social as a dangerous fiction, that all you have are individuals and all you have are individuals acting to entrepreneurialize their own capital, human capital. So what happens here is that individual subjects are changed from citizens, from actors, from people who move between family and work life and so forth, into just bits of human capital in every aspect of their lives. And we see this, of course, everywhere. We see, young people utterly preoccupied with their rankings and their ratings and their tweets and their retweets and their followers and the rest of it. That signifies a preoccupation, not just with one's general attractiveness, but one's ability to attract investors or attract other economic actors to invest in oneself. So that transformation of the subject across every aspect of its life is also an important feature of neoliberal governing reason. And of course, we've seen it. Those of us in universities or other kinds of workplaces have seen this transformation from a scene of social solidarity or collective action or mutual reinforcement, for example, in universities between the sciences and the humanities and so forth, to an every human for itself kind of operation. And that's fundamental to neoliberalism, is breaking us up into individual units of human capital, or in the case of a workplace, individual entrepreneurial units that either sink or swim, as opposed to being tended by the whole and gathered into the whole. So the social is changed, the subject is changed, the state is changed. And as soon as one begins talking about this, you say, oh yeah, that is the neoliberal order that I live in. Of course, to conclude this, there were dimensions of this project that those who conceived it, the original neoliberal intellectuals, and there were several different schools of neoliberals, those who conceived it had not counted on certain things. They had not counted, for example, on the extreme inequality and precarity that neoliberalism would produce, and the effects of that on a population that they hoped would actually be politically neutralized by neoliberalism as opposed to politically activated. And what we see today is a highly activated population. We call it populisms on both the right and the left. Everybody's angry at the distributions and the concentrations of wealth among a very small elite, and then the deracination, the uprootedness, and the precarity and the impoverishment of the many. And so that's one effect that the neoliberals hadn't counted on. Another one they hadn't counted on was what we today call financialization. And this is the growth of the finance sector at the expense of every other aspect of the economy. And really the indisputable importance of finance in every aspect of every nation state on the planet. Not only finance as a way of structuring investment in productive economic life, but finance in relationship to states. It's basically taken over the project of funding state endeavors, from militaries to infrastructure to healthcare. Private finance is everywhere. And one way to put this is that the final coup of neoliberalism was to not just privatize public goods, but to privatize the state itself. The financialization of the state, the overtaking of the state by private finance, is finally the privatization of states, the subordination of states to finance, to capital, in a way that, again, the original neoliberals hadn't counted on. They counted on the state being able to basically titrate and manage different aspects of markets and of capital in a way that would facilitate capital. They didn't count on states themselves being so overtaken by capital that they can't do that anymore. They're the servants. That finance is the master and the states are the servants. Long answer, but now we have it basically laid out. That's neoliberalism as a form of reason. I should add one more thing.
Please.
The other aspect of it as a form of reason is that it gets in our heads, as it were. It governs everything we do. We think constantly about how to enhance our capital value and how to prevent that capital value from being depleted or drained. And we see this in every aspect of human existence today, from rich to poor. And that is a very different way of life and of being governed than one saw, for example, in the post-war social states of the 60s, even the 50s, 60s, 70s. Okay, enough.
Wonderful, great. But it comes also to values, neoliberalism, apparently. I mean, across your writings, ideals such as freedom, tolerance, rights, and individual choice appear as not only as democratic achievements, but also as sites where power operates in subtle ways. So you mentioned at least three main aspects there, but how do these values become detached from democratic equality and redirected towards exclusion, moralism, or authoritarian forms of politics then?
There are two different ways to answer this. One would just be to note the extent to which neoliberalism has intensified a nihilism that was already developing and spreading throughout a good deal of Western culture. And to elaborate that point a little bit, nihilism was a term first really theorized as a social and political and cultural phenomenon in the late 19th century and early 20th century by thinkers like Nietzsche and Weber, but also Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, the early existentialists. And what they understood was that once science and reason arise to displace the authority of God in the Enlightenment, you lose the fundamental foundations of values They 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 continue to exist. Values continue to operate, but they're not secure any longer in what were their theological foundations. And reason and science can't substitute for that theology, because both of them only explain how things work. They don't explain to us what to value. So nihilism is understood in this way as kind of developing and increasingly saturating life in the West. And then capitalism intensifies that. So how does neoliberalism further intensify that? Well, if neoliberalism says, look, all there really is in life is economic action. We aren't complex creatures. We're just Homo economicus, economic man. That's all we are, and that's all we are across every aspect of life, from dating and mating to job seeking, to investments in education, to choosing friends. We are just engaged in a kind of constant, not just transactionalism, but a kind of constant alertness to what enhances our value and what could endanger that value as bits of human capital. So neoliberalism, by economizing every aspect of life, really puts that nihilistic developmental project through the 20th century on steroids. It really intensifies it. So that's one way to answer your question, what happens to values. But there's a more specific one that I think you're fishing for, which is what happens to the fundamental values of equality, liberty, fraternity, of liberal or Republican democracy? What happens to those values? Well, if it's true that what neoliberalism does is take everything and transform it into an economic order of value, an economic set of metrics, let's see what it does to equality, liberty, and fraternity. Equality, the neoliberals say, is only the equal right to win or lose in a market. As they put it in their most honest moments, it's the equal right to inequality. It's the equal right to give it your best shot and win or lose. But it's not equality in any more substantive sense than that. Liberty is the liberty to do whatever you can, whatever you want within the limits of the law, and obviously increasingly outside the limits of the law, to enhance your competitive positioning. So liberty is quite literally the right to do or say anything that will help you in your competitive positioning in the social, the political, the economic sphere. And that includes the right to say anything in the world, no matter how insulting or egregious. That includes the right to do just about anything short of, obviously, killing another. So liberty is also reduced in value to essentially a private property right, where you're the property. You have the right to do what you will with yourself. And fraternity, as I've already discussed, goes the way of Margaret Thatcher's riff on Hayek's "there is no such thing as society." It just doesn't exist. There's no fraternity in a neoliberal order. So there goes the social contract. There goes the social compact that says, what your government is supposed to do is essentially take care of its people on some level and assure minimal thresholds of survival, of protection, and also produce an order of at least modest solidarity or society, freedom understood as participation in popular rule, where freedom has a political dimension to it, and equality as something more substantive than an order of winners and losers, the right to enter that order. So that's what happens to values on a more precise level than just the nihilistic diminution of them.
Great, thank you very much. Basically, you also answered my my fourth question. So I skipped to the fifth one. Half a question. It's not really a question. Perhaps I would certainly appreciate your comment on that. I've long been struck by the thought that neoliberalism, as you also explained, is a great profiteer, a great plunderer, seizing everything, as you said, in its path. So, yet its theft is not limited to the rights or democratic capacities of its own citizens, as in the USA, for example. Neoliberalism, I believe, it's not my idea. It's something I've learned. Shows neoliberalism shows how it can even expropriate the possibility of citizenship, rights, and democratic capacity, even if movements arise in another country to resist its entrenched norms. They can be appropriated instantly, always to the benefit of neoliberalism and its values. So in this regard, neoliberalism operates through a profound deception while it has already dispossessed its own citizens, as in the USA, through stripping freedoms, welfare, health, and minority rights. It presents or pretends, let's say, a veneer of legitimacy for others elsewhere.
If I understand your comment, let me just reflect it back and see if I've gotten it right. Under the guise of freedom, neoliberalism essentially strips human beings of every other aspect of survival, including citizenship in certain cases. Is that part of your point?
Absolutely. But with a promise to others in other lands, in other countries, that we are bringing you freedom, that we are bringing you the values that is already lost in these nihilistic territories, let's say.
And I think, the US experiment in Iraq is actually a really superb example of this. After we toppled Saddam Hussein and began the de-Baathization project, that project was pretty minor compared to the effort to neoliberalize the country as a whole. And that involved everything from denationalizing the banks and almost every other state-owned industry, to making all of Iraq's assets available for external investment and plunder. And it transformed the country very rapidly, and it was all done under the sign of freedom, of making a people who had been oppressed free. And of course, what it did was both intensify long simmering conflicts in Iraq, brought the Taliban to Iraq, which hadn't been there before. It made a mess at the civil and political level, but it also cast many Iraqis who had been living a kind of middling level of survival and thriving into poverty and debt. And indebtedness, of course, is one of the great tricks of neoliberal austerity. It transforms industries and entire cities and regions into indebted ones where they can never climb out, and then austerity measures are imposed, and then the effect is essentially to produce an increasingly desperate population that may turn right, may turn left, may simply submit, and in some cases just commit suicide. So I'm accepting your thesis, I think, and just elaborating a bit on it.
So thank you. Wendy, I quote a paragraph from the book In the Ruins of Neoliberalism. You say, I'm quoting you, in short, the neoliberal critique of society and social justice in the name of freedom and traditional moral norms has become the common sense of a robust neoliberal culture today. At its extreme, it is alt-right red pill ideology. In its more moderate form, it is the conviction that life is determined by genetics, personal responsibility, and market competition. So, end of quote. Um, Here I'm somehow compelled by a question, perhaps a bit fundamental question, that figures such as Trump, Erdogan, or Musk himself, and the broader discourse of the right pursue a form of authority, a certain solidity when it comes to traditional values, like monarchies, like Iranian monarchies, that when it comes to values, they are very traditional. They eradicate Islam, but stay with the traditional values. This functions in constant interplay with the fluidity of the market, producing a
Mhm.
dynamic tension. The forms of authority are manifold, I know, but often surprisingly orthodox, mostly promoting family values, against feminism, against LGBT rights, against Muslims, against immigrants. It includes all Iranian, I mean, mostly it also applies to Iranian monarchies to these days. So my question is, what is your take? What we are witnessing is a decline, is a kind of equilibrium between a rigid masculinity or a rigid command, but a market fluidity. What is this coexistence? What does it mean to you?
Yeah. Okay. It's such an interesting problem because there there has always been a very strong tension between those on the right who simultaneously endorse family and religious values and a so-called free market. And in the United States, the beginning of the what was called the neoconservative movement in the 70s was launched by a guy named Irving Kristol, who wrote a book called Two Cheers for Capitalism. He thought that capitalism did a great job of producing wealthy societies and um, building greater and greater possibilities for all. Those were the two cheers. But he withheld the third cheer, which is because capitalism, Kristol understood, had a terrible effect on morality, on families, on the integrity of neighborhoods, on tradition, because it's an innovative, constantly destructive, constantly changing and order of things, and because it's also um, a political economy that is all about attracting our desire for consumption. And all of this he understood pretty close to the Frankfurt School, it had the effect of destroying the moral fabric of society. So what you get are these, we'll call them right wing or neo-monarchists, or today they call themselves post-liberals, who want to simultaneously affirm capital and markets and figure out how to use the state to attenuate its effects. And that means using the state to support families, to transform education, to make education more oriented toward tradition and less toward critical thinking, to support religion and allow a post secular religious order to unfold again. And I don't think though I started by describing it as a movement in the US, you see versions of this all over the world. You see it in Modi's India, you see it obviously in Iran, you see it in Orban's Hungary. What is Orban doing? He's basically building a vision of Hungary that is built on family, church, and property to some degree, and involves diseducating the people. It involves challenging intellectual life. It involves heavy statism to support this moral theological project. At the same time that capitalism is in its way undoing it. But these guys are smart about that. That's why I started by mentioning Crystal. He recognized, yep, capital's undoing it, so we need the state to re-cement those things and to support those things. And we need the state to hold off or hold back against all those reformers who want to challenge gender norms, challenge family, challenge the order of sexuality, promote women's reproductive freedom, but also promote racial and ethnic integration in cities, multiculturalism, all of that. The state has to be used to ward that off, secure tradition, secure traditional ethnic groupings and language-based nationalisms, and secure above all religion and family. And they're pretty good at it. So even though, you and I can say, but there's a contradiction at the heart of it, they'll say, yeah, contradiction at the heart of it. Our task is to manage that contradiction. It's to figure out how to use the state to offset capital's effects. And then what you have in the middle are figures like Trump and many others who are manifestly immoral, non-religious, not themselves embodying that order of family, tradition, and religion, but speaking the political discourse of it.
It doesn't really sound strange to me because and today in among a lot of Iranian diaspora, especially among Marxists, I really hear the same voice that they're not necessarily religious, but they stick to those values. That's why I say they're more traditional than religious in a lot of cases, and they're a lot Islamophobe than religious. So another comment, a little long, that under these conditions, amid the cumulative pressure of the varied forms of tragedies we are witnessing presently, be it in Iran, in Gaza, in Sudan, there arises a powerful temptation to fabricate a totalizing explanatory system, a coherent narrative, to absorb every fracture of catastrophe that we're experiencing. While I admit this, I admit that there is this temptation to leave parts of the truth unexamined in my comment. I have been particularly struck, Wendy, by a significant role of outsourcing today in different ways of life. So I just read my comment, and I would be really thankful to hear your idea that neoliberal rationality systematically outsources political judgment, democratic responsibility, and collective self-rule to market metrics, expert knowledge, and even technocratic governance. Yet I go a little further, and I want to add that and suggest that in order to preserve its own legitimacy or even its own morality, this order must also, the neoliberal order also outsources its negative residuals. For example, its violence, its failures, its ethical debts. So these are displaced onto other sides, other actors, other modes of responsibility, as they call it. So thus, alongside the transactional discourse that you also mentioned of interest and utility, there, for me, unfolds a parallel regime in which morality itself is outsourced removed from the center of political life and reassigned to distant abstractions, humanitarian spectacles, or any delegated moral authority. So sorry for the long comment.
No, it's interesting. I heard you say outsourcing at first and thought it's partly the way that neoliberalism is so good with scapegoating. But you're not talking about scapegoating. You're actually talking about outsourcing political and moral judgment. But to where? I need to understand a bit more of what you're suggesting.
I mean, there are places where evil is more embodied, and like Iran is an example there for me, or let's say, I mean, China, North Korea. And I think there can be easily outsourced such evil, such violence, such failure, such inefficiency can be. I know it's very abstract, but it has been.
I wonder if what you mean is that it disavows its violences. It's not so much that it turns them over to another agent, but or maybe you do mean that, but that it disavows its violences. I mean, the quintessential example of this is the original experiment with neoliberalism in the overthrow of Pinochet. I'm sorry, the installation of overthrow of Allende and the installation of Pinochet, and the tremendous violence that neoliberal revolution entailed. The violence itself was disavowed by the Chicago boys for years. I mean, they got pressed on it for years. You know, how can you say this is good for a nation when you've got people rounded up in a stadium being shot at point blank range, and political prisoners and the disappeared, and then the violences of the union smashing that followed that, and everything else. And that was a disavowal. But are you talking about a disavowal like that, or an outsourcing, actually sending it to some other party to do the work?
I'm sort of convinced that disavowal is a better word for that here.
Okay, because I do think that is absolutely part of the so-called peaceful neoliberal revolution, that it got to use soft power rather than violence. And of course, we know there's a tremendous amount of violence in neoliberal transformations, but violence that ranges from the actual shootings and knockings of heads, breaking up unions, or destroying opposition, to what I would call the more quotidian violence, or somebody like Rob Nixon called slow violence, of simply sinking people into despair, masses and masses of people into despair, or the uprooting, the upheavals that neoliberal transformations of production and industry, disseminating it around the world, and the loss of jobs, and with it neighborhoods, and with it towns, and survival itself for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. So there's a tremendous amount of violence, dislocation, deracination, disruption that neoliberalism engages in, while speaking in soothing managerial tones about its downsizing, or its transformation, or its of companies, or its discovery of untapped possibilities. You know, it's got a whole set of languages. Even the transformation in the financial language from leveraged buyouts, or hostile takeovers, which kind of reveal what they are, to simply referring to private equity now as buying neighborhoods, housing, healthcare, care homes, whole regions, whole states. And private equity sounds so soft and decent compared to hostile takeovers, leveraged buyouts, and those sorts of things. So yes, I think it has a language and a practice of intense disavowal, and that it is our task to understand what's being disavowed and what that in turn permits in the first way that I heard your question, what it permits in the way of scapegoating. How then something like migration becomes the source of a town's problem, as opposed to the moving of the power plant or the demolition of jobs or the takeover of apartment buildings by private equity in major cities that make life fundamentally unaffordable for all but the rich. And the scapegoating of immigrants or of elite politicians is part of what that disavowal then permits. It's confusing enough that it leads people to just point to what's near. They must be my problem. That must be why I'm suffering. Or it's feminism. You know, if all these women hadn't gone to work and they hadn't become uppity, I'd still have someone at home taking care of the children and being quiet and content, as opposed to my wrecked family life. So there's lots of ways that that disavowal turns into a scapegoating, especially on the right.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I mean, I do agree that the proper description for that is scapegoating and disavowal, as you brilliantly explained. Yet there is something when it comes to violence. I think I tend to use this outsourcing again. So let me.
Okay, let me listen closely
Right.
and figure out
Yeah. So
what's
yeah.
working for you there.
I try to really formulate it
Okay.
in my non-native way. So, I mean, when it comes to violence, neoliberalism, it seems that it's not like there is not this like blatant violence and tries to hide violence in the best possible way. So the old forms of violence and old forms of aggression are usually avoided to keep that morale, to keep that morality that we were talking about. Then I was thinking of a scholar that I interviewed a couple of years ago, a scholar of war, Mary Calder, and she, in her book, draws a crucial distinction between old and new regimes of war, or old and new wars, the name of her book, actually. So, according to Calder, conflicts are no longer defined by symmetrical confrontations between sovereign states with standing armies, but by fragmented constellations of state, non-state, and private actors. So there, in her argument, violence is dispersed rather than centralized. So in this shift that she explains, warfare is increasingly contracted out. And I think here my word is outsourced, probably, if you agree. So in this shift, warfare is increasingly outsourced or contracted out, not only to private military companies, but also, as we saw in cases such as Starlink about Iran, or American oil companies in Venezuela today, like Chevron, something more economical, which hides this violent phase, um, treats war as something that can be delegated, that can be externalized, that can be managed. So, in that regard, I just want to add one sentence that what is unprecedented in Iran, perhaps it is a little too obsessive of me to go that far, but because I think I thought recently a lot about it. What is unprecedented about Iran these days is a scale at which war, through statements of Trump or Iranian monarchists, is effectively transferred to the people themselves. So this might appear very self-evident, I know, yet it marks a decisive transformation for me. Like, civilians are mobilized through calls and incitements from outside, issued by the United States, Israelis, son of the Shah or other Zionist movements, to go to the streets and fight, which predictably, as you said, results in more repression and more killing of people. So the novelty here does not lie in a state violence as such, but in the way war is displaced onto others, no longer waged directly, but enacted through intermediaries, populations, and bodies to carry the cost. It's so long, but there I was thinking the
No,
whole.
it's a very interesting point. I think that's right. And I think, one way to put this, a little different from what you're saying, is that war is now disseminated throughout political and economic spaces. It's no longer about sovereign nation versus sovereign nation. And obviously you see this too in the so-called trade wars, the tariff wars, all the rest of it, which are intermingling issues of national security, of uprisings, and of economic advantage. So war is disseminated throughout, but so also is an economic order of things disseminated throughout throughout every sphere, including the sphere of war. So one way to put this is the loss of boundedness of these spheres. You've got war, or you've got economies, but also another way to put it is just that I think outsourcing maybe, or overflowing onto a people, an aspiration, an international scene of these war, but also terror metaphors. I want to add terror into the specter of war, because certainly that's how these repressions are enacted. These are terrorists, both in your country and, I mean, both in Iran and here in the U.S. The protesters struggling against ICE, struggling against roundups by federal troops, are declared terrorists when, in fact, the terror is coming from the military toward the people, but the people are declared now the combatants and the illegal combatants.
Thank you. I still have like a couple of more questions if you have time and patience.
Let's do 2 more questions.
Right. Okay. So, perhaps again, it's not a questions. I just read my comment and definitely would be happy to hear your idea. So, neoliberalism appropriates. I mean, a lot of them I've been inspired by your own work, so it's not my ideas even. So, neoliberalism appropriates far more than we are aware of, I believe. So, particularly perspectives that appear political or even emancipatory, and which have been celebrated in different ways. So basically, my problem started when I was thinking about the emphasis some people on the left had on horizontalist accounts of politics. So I was thinking such views demand careful scrutiny. Otherwise, they serve irresponsibility rather than liberation. So the orientation advanced by people like Michael Hart or Tony Negri, which I've engaged with them in different conversations, I mean, with Hart at least, posits the end of sovereignty as if the age of governing authority is concluding. I mean, even when partially sympathetic, I regard their claim primarily as descriptive of what is happening rather than a kind of resistance or a kind of emancipation. What do you think about this sort of analysis, this sort of theories or takes of what is happening?
I completely agree with you. I think that sadly, both anarchism and horizontality actually closely read are effects of a neoliberal discourse rather than resistances to it. anarchy is essentially a version of what the extreme ideological account of neoliberalism aspires to. No rules, no state, just natural order emerging from individual actions. And I mean, that's not all there is to anarchy, but that aspect of it is where the Venn diagrams between neoliberalism and anarchy really overlap. And this post-sovereign fantasy is, of course, also the original neoliberal fantasy that capital rules the world and is essentially just moving freely as it needs and wants to, and navigating sovereignty in a more and more diminished fashion. I also think Tony Negri and Michael Hart would have to rethink their thesis vis-a-vis the present. It's not that sovereignty is having a huge comeback, but it's having a huge symptomatic expression as it goes down. And we're seeing that in the international order, but also in the behavior of individual sovereigns in repressing dissent in their own nations. And that's at odds with the order, I think, that Hart and Negri thought they were heralding.
Great, thank you. And my last question is, neoliberalism can seize opportunities, but that they can derive, and it can derive from, so I mean, again, the point is clear that neoliberalism can take advantage of any opportunity, but then I was thinking that it can also drive benefit from failure, from injustice, from violence, from fear. I mean, that was interesting that you were also talking about terror, from pervasive insecurity. So I was thinking of these heartened proposals posed to Palestinians to revive their economy after the genocide, or ostensibly designed to cultivate collective welfare and a better society. Something that absurdly emerges from a system that withholds precisely these goods from its own citizens in the US. So more concretely, even a government that suppresses and brutalizes its citizens can be turned into a site of profit and opportunity for neoliberalism. So Trump, for instance, refrains from direct war for a simple reason now with Iran. It is my take that he must first discern how to convert the circulating violence, the blood, the fear, the suffering of people into benefit, into advantage. And in this calculus, failure, oppression, and even terror in the citizens in Iran, they can be used as obstacles to take advantage, to benefit.
I agree with you. I mean, watching the wolves prowl around as the so-called ceasefire in Gaza was beginning to take shape, the predatory wolves so excited to begin rebuilding the Riviera of Gaza was just a perfect expression of this. The excitement about the possible profits, the possible development opportunities that were coming out of that nightmare of genocide, of ecocide, of scholasticide, of a destroyed land and a destroyed people, but not finished. It's a beautiful example of that. I mean, capitalism has always been good at it, but neoliberalism is exceptional at taking destruction and extracting the last bit of profitability from it that it can. And again, that's what you see in the practices of asset managers and private equity companies, is the excitement at taking over businesses, driving them into the ground, industries, driving them into the ground, and then extracting what they can in their death throes. And yeah, that is your description is poetic and unfortunately accurate. And the only note of promise that I want to end up on in our conversation is that I think that a great many people in the world have had it with this mode of organization and planetary destruction and human destruction, and that you are seeing signs all over the place of not just a turn to fascism, but also a turn to resistance and beyond, to building futures that are more than resistant, but actually have a different order of things at their heart.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Wendy, for this nice conversation.
Thank you, Maddie. It was really terrific.